Welcome back, everyone, to our next keynote presentation. I was in one of our workshops, which was amazing, on the Asian American experience and biracial experience. And then I heard that the workshop here was also amazing. So I'm hoping you're learning and taking things away and growing and connecting with people and networking and making some new friends and maybe finding, again, some old friends that you haven't seen for a while. So welcome back, and I'm going to have Dr. Fort now come and introduce our speakers for today's keynote, this afternoon's keynote.
Well, welcome back to those who are joining us online and those who are coming from our other workshop over the way in our theology building. I'm so delighted to welcome our special guest. As Dr. Strachan said earlier today, we have purposefully invited folks who are doing plenaries to present as either a pair or as a group, to talk about what it looks like to think about difference and gap and distinction and experiences together, and to explore those things together. I'm delighted that we have this upcoming session entitled The Integration of Nepantla, the in-between as whole. Joining us today for our second plenary are Drs. Jessica ChenFeng and Dr. Saul Barcelo, and we are excited for them to share about this middle space. Dr. Jessica ChenFeng is Associate Professor of Marriage and Family Therapy at Fuller Theological Seminary. She is known, yes, shout out. She is known in the field of marriage and family therapy for her clinical expertise and scholarship, integrating socio-contextual lenses of race, gender, and generation into work with minoritized individuals, families, and communities. She is also a dear friend. I'm delighted to have her. With her is her colleague and friend, Dr. Saul Barcelo. I probably am saying his name wrong, so I ask for forgiveness in advance. Joined the faculty of Loma Linda University School of Religion in 2021 and serves as a director of the Center for Whole Person Care. His research interests include topics of spirituality in healthcare, healthcare chaplaincy, ethics, the intersection of race and religion in society, theologies of liberation, and Latinx identity and spirituality. I am delighted to have the two of them presenting, and I ask you to welcome them with me.
It is so good to be here and to be here with Dr. Barcelo. I'm going to do a brief intro, tell you about ourselves, our collaborative working relationship. Before we get to that, can you help me go to our screen? This is a brief overview of our presentation. Thank you so much. We're going to tell you about us, our collaborative work. Then Dr. Barcelo will help us understand the origins of Nepantla. What is this term that we are going to be unpacking today? We'll move into talking about belonging within the U.S. empire, and then we'll conclude with theological and clinical reflections. So first of all, we should explain, how do I know Dr. Barcelo? He will refer to me as Jessica. I'm going to start calling him Saul. Okay. So this is a picture of us presenting at the Conference on Medicine and Religion a couple years ago in Ohio. And so before I came to Fuller, returned to Fuller's faculty a couple years back, I was at Loma Linda University, my other alma mater, where I did my PhD and MFT. And I worked as the Associate Director of Physician Vitality, which essentially meant that myself and my colleague, the director, we served our physicians at Loma Linda as their therapists. So Saul and I were part of an interdisciplinary team for the School of Medicine, and we're the people in the middle, sandwiched by our beloved friends and colleagues. They are both associate deans, respectively. Dr. Zane Yi of School of Religion, Dr. Amy Hayton of the School of Medicine at Loma Linda. And so Dr. Hayton is responsible still for the very robust curriculum at Loma Linda, which is one of the few, it was the first School of Medicine that is formational in Christian identity of its students. So there's this whole curriculum addressing physician selfhood. So just like therapists, we talk about self of the therapist, our formation, Christian integration. They were building out that curriculum. And so we both got to take part in that, and this is a presentation we gave on that work, teaching resilience and whole person care to future doctors. But beyond the professional collaboration, what I want to talk about, Dr. Fort mentioned, when the invitation came, Jessica, what do you think about presenting? Who would be your co-presenter? And honestly, Saul was the first person that came to mind. And I knew in advance, I was going to be on sabbatical. I'm on sabbatical this quarter. And that he and I had a lot of conversations, especially through the pandemic, through the social, political turmoil that affects both of our communities. And the way that Latino and Asian communities often sit in that racial triangulation between black and white. And so out of our personal conversations, our concern and care for each other's communities, I thought this would be a fun leaning in to figure out stuff. What are we going to talk about? And I'm going to just be really honest. This is a very vulnerable presentation for me because I'm out of my area of expertise. I feel like many of you, if you've heard me present at Fuller, oftentimes it's intersectional with Asian American identity. It is, just MFT clinical work. I learned a whole lot, and literally to last night, lots of revelatory aha moments for me that I'm still working through the content. And so appreciate that while we are presenting on this idea of Nepantla, the in-between, that we are living it out through this material and the process. Dr. Barcelo, Saul, if I can invite you, if you want to add anything, and you can transition to your part.
Well, I was tempted to cancel and say no, because obviously I am aware of your specialty, which I'm thinking, how do I contribute? Just sitting in this space today, I feel like I have so much to learn, and I'm grateful just for the opportunity to be here. And hopefully I can return just as somebody who will attend and promote it at Loma Linda so other students and faculty can join us. So thank you again, and thank you for the invitation. The only reason I say yes is because of our friendships. Otherwise, I gotta be honest, I would have canceled. So this is kind of my CV. You just get a glimpse of kind of what I've done in the last couple decades. My first church was actually on the campus of Loma Linda. That's called Campus Hill Church. I started ministry even though I was a business major, wrestling with the call. I wanted to be rich, and God said, no, you're going to be in ministry. So anyways, I joined the church thinking I'll prepare myself to go to seminary. I was grateful that the first female Caribbean American senior pastor was looking for people who are different and who are not always fitting in the regular settings. So she gave me an opportunity at this church. Spent about 8 years in church ministry, and then I transitioned into not too far from there to the Children's Hospital, where I work as a chaplain for Peds ICU. 10 years just with all those cases. I have to be honest, I think I could have cared for myself a little better as I pour myself to the families, to the patients, and to the staff. I did burn out, and during the pandemic, I transitioned into education, again, just in the other side of the campus. So I haven't left Loma Linda. I do this all grounded in my family, which I share a little picture. This is one evening we're walking in La Paz, just kind of on a vacation. And so I'm always grounded in my family. And then the last picture is, it's a painting by Joaquin Torres Garcia, which is titled América Invertida, which if you follow his journey, spent decades in North America and in Europe. You gone to Barcelona, you've seen the Gaudi's masterpiece. He helped with Gaudi's art. And then he returns towards the end of his journey to his home country of Uruguay and realized, what was I doing? This is where I should start instead of going everywhere else. So he founded a school of art based on, you know what, the South should be our North. And that's where we should begin. So it's my own journey of constantly decolonizing, returning to where I come from so I can learn and I can share with others. So that's a little bit about me. And again, once again, I'm grateful to be hanging out with you.
So earlier, Dr. Fort introduced that I serve here as a program chair of the DMFT program. Yes, and our DMFT students are here in town for this weekend. And I want to say, it's so good to see everyone. And it's also that Dr. Hardin, our interim chair, is amazing. I haven't heard a single thing about the program. So everything is going well, but so good to be here for today. Dr. Saul shared his personal background a little bit, and I want to say a little bit more about my own connection to today's topic. So this picture on the left, you might assume this is the day of my PhD graduation, and my parents are there with me. You'll see that my dad is wearing my cap. He is wearing one of my stoles, represents the Taiwanese flag. My mom is wearing the robe. And I picked this photo before I could identify why. In my body, I knew this is the photo I need to use for this introduction, and it's that it represents a million things without words, which is their migration, their sacrifice. And so my doctorate, even though I'm so grateful my parents never pushed me into it, it was my decision, there was a sense of this belongs to them as much as it belongs to me. So they would have never had the opportunity. My mother wanted to become a physician, a medical doctor, and because of her migration years, high school, college, those years, she could not. And you might hear a little bit more about that later. The other picture was taken at my home church. It's a Taiwanese church I grew up at. This is at my home church senior pastor's retirement last fall. And I wanted to share this with you because what is wild to me, I have never really unpacked this or discussed it until Saul and I were preparing for this presentation, which is I grew up in an Asian Latino church context. And my youth pastors, my closest friends, were Taiwanese who lived in Argentina and Brazil. And so the language most familiar to them, English was second, but the first was not Mandarin, not some Taiwanese, but it was Portuguese or Spanish. What I've also not talked about a lot is that my mother is fluent in Spanish. She first migrated to Buenos Aires before coming to the U.S. And so I don't know to what degree I will share various stories about that, but this part of my own identity is something very dear to my heart, but there's not really a social context to unpack it or to even discuss it. So the formation of my faith happened with Asian Latino pastors and siblings. And so while we had the first-gen Taiwanese American elders prepare Taiwanese food for us, all of our parties was Brazilian barbecue and chimichurri and all kinds of foods from South America. And so, and so the way I live in liminal spaces and in-betweenness, even well into my 40s, I feel like I keep finding and discovering new parts of myself that are exciting. And I think this is really part of the spirit of Nepantla that Saul has been teaching me What I also want to say is this. I know here at Fuller, we could have more Latino faculty. We could have more Spanish-speaking supervisors in our communities to meet the needs of our community. And in general, because I'm constantly presenting on Asian Americanness, I'm aware of my own lack of understanding around Latino American populations. And so in that, today, what I want to be explicit about, this is a part that feels new to me, is that in our collaboration, we're trying to figure out the dance. Like, what are we centering? What is the content? How do we move through our positionality? What are we discussing? And what I want to make clear is today we are centering the legacies, the wisdom, the ancestral knowledge of Latino communities. And the parts that I bring in that are my identity, the identity of the communities I represent, is in collaboration and support of. So I'm going to try my best to do that. It will not, be, I don't know what perfect even is, but this is the first time I've done it. What I also want to say is, worked with a lot of people collaborating on presentations, and what has really stood out is Saul, as a friend and colleague, really exemplifies a collaborative spirit. And there's not I think we were figuring out, I think both of us are quite deferential to the other. So you might sense that here. So we hope that you will allow us to show up in our collectivist energy. And so thank you, Saul. I will turn it over to you.
So I want to begin with a brief story told by philosopher Carlos Alberto Sanchez in his book, Blooming in the Ruins. He described an experience from childhood that helped us understand what it means to live between worlds. Perhaps some of you may even recognize something of your own story in this. Sanchez recalls being very sick as a child with a high fever that would not break. His mother cared for him in the way she had learned growing up, placing thin slices of potato on his forehead to draw out the fever, giving him herbal teas, doing what generations before her had done. But when his fever returned and did not improve, his parents took him to the hospital. There, the doctor questioned his mother sharply and dismissed her methods, implying she was irresponsible. There was also fear in that room, the fear many immigrant families know well, the fear of being judged, misunderstood, and even reported. At one point, the doctor said, "Señora, in America, if a child is sick, you bring him to the doctor. You don't cure him at home with potato slices." But Sanchez explains that what the doctor saw as ignorance was something very different. His mother was not neglectful. She was navigating two worlds, traditional ways of caring and new medical systems, which she was still learning to trust. Sanchez concludes, what the doctors didn't understand was that my mother had not yet fully assimilated to the American way of doing things. She still had a foot in the old ways while trying to find her footing in the new. My mother was neither here nor there, but somewhere in between, in the middle of two possible ways of doing things. My mother was Nepantla. What Sanchez names in his story is not unique to his family. Many people, many patients and communities we serve live in similar spaces in betweenness. The word he uses, Nepantla, comes from the Nahuatl language that means in the middle. To understand the depth of this term, we must briefly turn to the linguistic and historical origins within the Uto-Aztecan world and the migrations that shaped central Mexico long before the rise of Mexica, the people that later on was known as the Aztec. The Nahuatl people originated actually in the United States, southwestern region, eventually migrated due to persecution. Nahuatl-speaking groups began moving south around 500 BCE. Over time, Nahuatl became widely spoken in central Mexico. By the time the fall of the Tenochtitlan in 1521, Nahuatl had become a regional lingua franca. The term Nepantla was first recorded in the 16th century by a Franciscan missionary named Andrés de Olmos, who wrote one of the earliest grammars of the Nahuatl language. His work preserved aspects of the language as part of the broader missionary effort. In 1579, Diego Duran, a Dominican friar fluent in Nahuatl and deeply immersed in the culture of the Nahuatl people, recorded his frustrations in the book that you can access if you have the money, because it has not been published for a few years. But it's titled The Book of the Gods and Rights. Best known for his earlier work, The History of the Indies of New Spain, Duran created one of the first extensive Western accounts of Aztec history and religious practices, though he was criticized in his time for preserving what some saw as a heathen knowledge. In the Book of the Gods and Rights, Duran recounts how troubled he was by a dual religious life of the Nahuatl people. They would faithfully attend Mass on Sundays, yet continue to offer worship to their ancestor deities during the week. He once confronted an elder about this contradiction, and the elder simply replied, "Don't worry, Father, we are Nepantla, in between." Mexican anthropologist and historian would record Miguel León Portillo has defined Nepantla as a situation in which persons remain suspended in the middle between a lost or disfigured past and a present that has not been assimilated or understood. As we move from this quote, we must remember the historical and theological location of Diego Duran. He, like other missionaries of the 16th century, was formed within a highly structured theological system shaped by the late medieval Christendom and emerging colonial frameworks. This was a worldview deeply invested in categorization. Identity was expected to be singular, defined, and doctrinally clear. One belonged either fully within Christian orthodoxy or outside of it. Only decades earlier, in 1492, and the years that followed, the Spanish crown, with the help of the church, had expelled Jews and Muslims from the Iberian Peninsula. Communities who had lived for centuries in what we now call Spain, were forced into conversion, exile, and marginalization. Religious ambiguity or dual belonging was not tolerated. Missionaries arriving into Americas carry this history with them. They inherit a theological imagination that struggled to accommodate hybridity. The expectation was clear. One must fall under one religious category, renounce the other, and demonstrate visibly conformity. Duran's frustration in this passage reflects precisely that formation. His desire was to convert indigenous people, yet he encountered a reality that did not fit his binary framework. What he described as being neither fish nor fowl revealed not simply indigenous inconsistency, but his difficulty in comprehending a religious world that operated beyond rigid either-or boundaries. This moment, then, is not only about indigenous practices, it also exposes the limits of colonial theological categories. Angel Rama, wrote this wonderful book. I'll mention a little bit about it. But if Duran's accounts exposes the missionary discomfort with ambiguity, Angel Rama helped us understand what was actually unfolding beneath that tension. Rama, the Uruguayan literary critic and cultural theorist, developed the concept of transculturization to describe what occurs when two civilizations encounter one another, especially under unequal conditions of power. In the 16th century, this encounter took place when Europeans arrived on the lands that were not yet called America. The continent already bore names within its own civilization worlds. In Mesoamerica traditions, the land was known as Anahuac. In the Andean world, the Inca referred to the imperial realms of Tahuantinsuyo, meaning the four regions together. These names signal organized, complex societies with their own political, spiritual, and epistemological systems. The Europeans' renaming of the continent as America was not merely geographic. It marked a transfer of authority. To name is to claim interpretive power. It signals who would define reality moving forward. It is within this asymmetrical context of conquest, imposition, and survival that transculturation unfolds. Rama outlines 4 stages in this process. First, losses. Transculturation begins with an imbalance. There's no romantic symmetry here. Colonial dominance leads to destruction of temples, codices, ritual systems, languages, and forms of governance. Entire cosmologies were attacked. These losses were not incidental. They were structural consequences of colonial power. Second, selections. Yet, transculturation is not pure erasure. Rama emphasized agency within constraint. There are 2 kinds of selections: an internal selection in which indigenous communities or colonial subjects discern which elements of their cultural and spiritual core can be preserved, protected, or concealed. An external selection in which aspects of the incoming culture are adopted, adapted, or strategically embraced. These stages challenges the narrative of a passive conversion. Even within oppression, communities negotiate meaning. Third stage, rediscovery. In the process of losing and selecting, something else can occur, rediscovery. Certain elements of a culture that might not have been centrally emphasized before became newly important. Practices, symbols, or narratives gain renewed value precisely because they are threatened. Identity becomes more of a conscious articulated. Fourth stage, incorporations. Finally, there are incorporations. Yes, elements of the foreign culture become woven into daily life. They are no longer simply imposed. They are integrated, translated, and transformed. We see this not only in religious expressions, but in language, foodways, music, architecture, and social customs. What emerged is not purely indigenous nor purely European, but something reconfigured, something neither fish nor fowl, to return to Duran's phrase. Seen through Rama's framework, what Duran described with frustration can be understood instead as a dynamic reality of transculturation. What he perceived as inconsistency may in fact have been a cultural negotiation in real time. Elsa Cecilia Frost, a 20th century Mexican philosopher, in her essay Acerca de Nepantla, regarding Nepantla, she revisits Duran's accounts and offers a striking reinterpretation. She suggests that Nepantla does not describe only the in-betweenness of indigenous people or colonial subjects. It also reveals the in-betweenness of the colonizer. Frost observes that while Duran interpreted indigenous religiosity as unstable, neither fish nor fowl, he failed to recognize his own instability. The friar himself stood between worlds, between his Spanish past and his Mexican future. He arrived carrying the theological certainties of Iberian Christendom, yet the context he encountered began reshaping him. Unbeknownst to the missionaries, their Christianity was undergoing transformation. Their faith tradition was not simply being exported, it was being reconfigured through encounters. Frost suggests that by the time Spanish friars and conquistadores realized what was happening to them, the process of Nepantla, of being in between, was already well underway. There's a profound irony here. The indigenous elder knew he was in Nepantla. He could name his condition. Duran and his colleagues, however, did not perceive that they too were inhabiting the same space of transition. This insight allows us to see that colonization was not one directional imposition of culture. It was an encounter that altered both sides, though not symmetrically and not without violence. We can see this historically. Roman Catholicism in Latin America developed in forms that differ markedly from European Catholicism. Catholicism itself had to adapt, translate, and respond to indigenous cosmologies to risk failing in its evangelizing mission. In other words, Nepantla was not only the condition of the colonized, it became the condition of the colonizers. To move into a more contemporary U.S. context, we turn to Gloria Anzaldúa, a queer Chicana thinker and cultural theorist. Anzaldúa gives modern language to the experience of in-betweenness. In Borderlands, La Frontera, she reflects on what it means to grow up along the Texas-Mexican border. Yet for Anzaldúa, the border is never merely geographically. It's psychologically, cultural, sexual, and spiritual. It's a condition of living between languages, identities, and world. This is what she wrote, and this is how the book actually begins. The actual physical borderline that I'm dealing with in this book is the Texas, U.S. Southwest Mexican border, and she goes on. Her later work, published posthumously as a Light in the Dark or Luz en lo Oscuro, marks a noticeable shift. Rather than centering the language of borderlands, Anzaldúa returns explicitly to the Nahua term Nepantla. This is not rejection of her earlier work, but a deepening of it. Now let's unpack what she means. Nepantla as a liminal psychological space, which is perhaps the spaces that you navigate the most. For Anzaldúa, Nepantla is not just a geographical or cultural, it is internal. It is the space one inhabits when old frameworks no longer hold, but new ones have not yet solidified. It is the psychological terrain of transition, when identities feel unstable, when inherited narratives no longer fully explain who we are, when belonging feels fractured. This applies far beyond the US-Mexico border. Anyone navigating migration, racial ambiguity, gender identity, class mobility, religious changes, or institutional transitions may experience this liminality. Nepantla then becomes a human condition of threshold living. And I quote her, Nepantleras live in this tense balance, entre medios, in between, teetering on the edges in states of entregueras. We're not quite at home here, but also not quite at home over there. Like queer and bisexual people who must live in both straight and gay worlds, or like rural people living in cities stuck between the cracks of homes and other cultures. Experiences, dislocation, disorientation, we are forced, or we choose to live in spaces, categories that defy gender, race, class, sexual, geographic, and spiritual locations. Number two that I gather from her writings, identity, fragmentations, and recreation. Anzaldúa does not romanticize this space. Nepantla can feel disorienting. Parts of the seal of the self feels fragmented. There's grief for what is being left behind. There's anxiety about what is emerging. And I think as in your specialty, that's where you sit the most with your clients. But she also sees this as a generator. In Nepantla, identities are dismantled, but they're also reassembled. Meanings are questioned, but they're also rewritten. It is a side where narratives of the self can be authored. She also says, when it comes to cultural hybridity, Nepantla acknowledges that identity is rarely pure. It resists rigid categories. It makes room for hybridity, linguistic, racial, spiritual, intellectual. For many people in the U.S. context, bicultural families, multiracial identities, people navigating professional and community worlds, those negotiating faith and doubt, Nepantla names the tension of holding multiple worlds simultaneously. It legitimizes complexity rather than forcing simplification. Number four that I get from her writings is a space of creativity and transformation. Anzaldúa believes Nepantla is painful, but also creative. When older systems crack, imagination expands. Because one is not fully anchored in one world, one can see multiple perspectives. That double or triple vision becomes a source of insight. Transformation and healing becomes possible precisely because the rigid borders of identity have loosened. She suggests that wholeness is not a return to purity, but an integration forged through tension. Wholeness is just out of reach, she says, but attainable through conscious engagement with the in-between. In Blooming in the Ruins, once again, Sanchez argues that when cultures borrow from one another, what emerges is not merely a blend or a mixture, but something qualitatively new, a third reality. This resonates with Anzaldúa's insight. Nepantla is not dilution, it's emergence. For Sanchez, cultures formed in encounters are not statics. They are dynamic, always negotiating, always becoming. They do not sit comfortably inside one inherent tradition or another. Instead, they inhabit a space of transition. He points to contemporary hyphenated identities, Mexican-American, Asian-American, Irish-American, Filipino-American, African-American, as just examples. These identities are not incomplete versions of two worlds. They are lived expressions of Nepantla. They exist in movements. They are shaped by tensions. They resist final categorization. Sanchez ultimately suggests something even broader. To be Nepantla is simply to be in the middle of a process, whatever that process may be. Understood this way, Nepantla is not exceptional. It is profoundly human. Most of us live between ways of life, between traditions, between social expectations, between paradigms shift, between stability and uncertainty. In that sense, Nepantla becomes more than a cultural description. It becomes a strategy of survival. It names the capacity to endure pressure, whether from empire, colonial structures, rigid institutions, or inherent binaries, and yet continue to create meaning. So rather than seeing Nepantla as instability, we might begin to see it as a resistance, a refusal to be reduced to a narrow category, a way of inhabiting complexity without surrendering dignity. And that may be where this section leaves us. Not asking how to escape the in-between, but how to inhabit consciously, even courageously.
As I was listening to Saul, I think what struck me is this in-between way of living life has been around since the start of the world, I imagine. But just the wisdom and the inheritance we have from our ancestors of different communities is a encouragement to us today for the communities that are living in, struggling through these in-between spaces, not being recognized, literally being removed because they, quote unquote, do not belong. Do you want to speak to this? Yeah, but I think it's important. I think it's special. Yeah.
We always have two views in everything we do. This is actually a picture in the Mexico side of the border. And yet someone, an artistic poet, wrote, in this side, there's also dreams. So referring to the American dream.
So one of the things, it showed up in one of the slides earlier, but the experience of Nepantla exists because of colonization, right? The in-betweenness is necessary because there's a shift from one to another, often by imposition. So we're going to take a step back for the next few slides and look at what is belonging within the U.S. empire. Dr. Fort and Dr. Strawn earlier this morning helped us articulate terms, power, privilege, positionality. These are really important. I'm not going to go over this in detail, but we all either know this due to our training or we know it because of the relationships we live and the implicit or explicit messages we have from day-to-day life, right? We know that in the US, now it's more blatant than ever, the color of your skin, your social class, your citizenship to where you might have national, quote-unquote, belonging, the languages you speak or don't speak, quote unquote, fluently. There's just so many things that force us to feel like we do or don't belong, right? And there's a couple of references here. Many of you know Pamela Hayes' addressing model, which is helpful in breaking these things down. We know Kimberly Crenshaw and her work on intersectionality decades ago allows us to understand this across many different fields. Within the field of MFT, we have White and Epstein, narrative therapy, where we understand dominant and alternative discourses. That's another way of making sense of, belonging or not belonging. And then we have my mentors at Loma Linda, Carmen Knudsen-Martin and Doug Hunegart, the socio-emotional relationship therapy model that I use in my practice is very grounded in social context. And then there is Rhea Almeida, who is a social worker. She had a hierarchy of power, privilege, and oppression that she used to teach. So just sharing some references that may be helpful for you to look into. But we sort of know this by the way that we live day in and day out within the U.S. And I wanted to talk a little more explicitly about how we are impacted living within empire. And some of you know Kat Armas, one of our alumni. She is a Cuban-American author and speaker, and recently came out with a wonderful book, Liturgies for Resisting Empire. So a few of these pieces are her wisdom and knowledge from that book. She describes empire as systems, political, cultural, spiritual. Sometimes we think of it only as political, but it is all of these possibilities that rely on power, fear, and domination in order to control and to assert that power. And there are ideologies of empire. So when you live within empire, there are natural, conscious, often unconscious processes that we get used to. Dualism, we've talked a lot about this today. Binaries, definitions, hierarchy, there has to be some sort of order that turns into domination, and then the use of violence, and then there's scarcity as a result. The words that I added, it then reduces, it limits, it erases, it extracts, and it excludes. These are just natural consequences of that empirical mindset that goes through all parts of our lived experience. What I care most about is the relational impact of that. It is really important to this is not my area of study, but even as clinicians, chaplains, pastors, ministry leaders, many of us care about the person to person, the relational, but we need to be informed about the structures. Why is the relational interaction this way? We need to have a lens that is connected to the system, not just the family system, but larger systems. So an example of empire's impact on inner and interpersonal relationships, our value and worth is connected to productivity. What are we producing that contributes to society? Are you a good immigrant? Do you offer much to U.S. empire? That others are your competition. The Asians are coming to take your jobs, right? This has led to the killing of Asian Americans in U.S. history. It is a zero-sum game, right? If I win, you lose. If you win, I lose, right? That's the mentality that is bred within this sort of thinking. It robs our capacity to appreciate difference, right? Just like Dr. Jeff Chan spoke in the workshop, for those of you who were here for that one, it is hard to have an I-thou connection, because if you are competing for resources, if you are here to produce, we ourselves see ourselves as an it. How can I see you as a thou, right? If I have not yet seen myself as that. So it is hard to really appreciate the depth of who we are and then the person next to us. Yeah, I think that's all I wanted to say.
So I think in this section we were thinking we can share from our own communities a little bit of how empire really I guess affect us in one way or another. And I thought, I'm just gonna focus on the names, labels that we use. I often hear from clinicians, especially in healthcare, like, well, how do I refer to my patient? I'm like, have you asked their name? And and so, but I know what they mean. They want to talk about demographics, and so there are so many terms that we can use. For example, you can only imagine Hispanic usually is referred to someone who speaks Spanish, who coming from a country, a Spanish speaking from Latin America, from Caribbean, but even Europe, Spain. then again, there's some who may argue, well, isn't there a colonial terminology? I mean, if you study what happened in 1492, how colonial forces came and took over, doesn't that bother you? For some, that is a term that they do not want to use. So there are other terms like Latino or Latina, an adjective and a noun that describes a person of Latin America origins or descendants, especially one who lives in the United States. I did share with Jessica that I didn't know I was Latino. All my life, I grew up in Mexico. When I migrated to the United States, suddenly somebody gave me a name. You're Latino. And I'm like, I am? And so, yes. So if we come from a country from Latin America origin, we have another name that is given to us. Walter Mignolo in his book, The Idea of Latin America, reminds us that the concept actually related to Latinidad was used in France by intellectuals and state officers to take the lead in Europe among the configurations of Latin countries involved in the Americas. That's Italy, Spain, Portugal, and France itself. And it allowed also to confront the United States' continuing expansions toward the South. Latin America is not so much a subcontinent as it is a political project of Creole mestizo elites. On the one hand, it created the idea of new and the fifth continent unit. On the other hand, it lifted up the population of European descent and erased the Indian, indigenous, and the Afro populations of the continent. Latinx, another term that is popular, especially in academia and entertainment, emerged in the 2000s. You know more about it. What's interesting, though, is in a 2020 Pew Research Center report, they found out that only 1 in 4 U.S. Hispanics or Latinos have actually heard of the term Latinx. And just 3% actually use it to describe themselves. So again, it's very popular in academia. We use it. I use it in entertainment. It's very inclusive. But when asked about their preferred pan-ethnic label, 61% said they prefer Hispanic. 29% prefer Latino, and only 4% prefer Latinx. The research also shows that the country of origin matters more than the umbrella terms many people are more likely to identify as Mexican, as Puerto Rican, Cuban, Salvadoreño, or by any other national identity, especially in the first generation. May change in the second, and you add the concept of American to that identity. Fascinating book by Dr. Laura Gomez, Inventing Latinos. This is the tension that she explicitly says in these books. She reminds us that racial and ethnic identities operate along 2 intersection forces. On the one hand, individuals and communities exercise agency. We assert, negotiate, and sometimes choose how to identify. On the other hand, identities are not formed in a vacuum. They're assigned, categorized, and often imposed by social and political systems. Race, then, is both something we claim and something that is given to us. If you were part of the 120 million people watching the Super Bowl, perhaps you were caught by Bud Bunny at the end when he said, "God bless America." For a long time, we thought the U.S. was America, but then when he started naming all these countries, including Jamaica and our friends up north, Canada, people were like, what? What is going on here? Laura Maria Pigosi, it reminds us in her book, Caring for and Understanding Latinx Patients in Healthcare. She says, Latinos are not and should not be treated as a homogeneous group. There are 20 countries for whom Spanish is official language. One can argue if you're from Puerto Rico and want independence, it could be 21, but there are 20 to 21 countries for whom Spanish is official language. These people embody many distinct origins, groups which vary in nationalities, histories, races, ethnicities, and culture. There are also significant individual differences in socioeconomic status, educational levels, and immigrant generations, levels of acculturation, and English language ability. In the U.S., at least, many will identify, many of the Latino population that you serve actually will come from the Mexican-American background. Many of them can trace their ancestry to the time when the American Southwest belonged to Mexico. So you perhaps have heard that idea, I did not cross the border crossed me, that's them. A significant portion also arrived at the turn of the 20th century following the Mexican Revolution. Many more came as braceros during the World War II to fill labor shortages brought about the war. Again, migration from the U.S. Commonwealth of Puerto Rico was also significant prior to the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act. Cubans, Salvadoreños, I mean, you name it, these are some of the largest groups of people that will identify. The complexity of naming becomes even clearer when we look at the U.S. Census. Categories have not been stable. They have shifted over time. In 1930, Mexican briefly appeared as a racial category, only to be removed with many of them expected to select white. By the 1970s, the census introduced a broader Hispanic origin questions tied to national background. By 2000, respondents were asked separately about race and whether they were of Hispanic or Latino origin. Today, Hispanic or Latino is officially classified as an ethnicity, not a race. What this shows is that identity categories are not neutral. They are administratively constructed, politically negotiated, and historically revised. The efforts to classify millions of people into fixed boxes reveals both the necessity and the limitations of this system. And before we speak of Latino or Latinx as if it were a single identity, we also have to acknowledge the profound diversity within the community itself. Latinidad is not a monolithic, as we mentioned earlier. It carries the imprint of a long colonial history across Latin America, 500 years of coloniality, one marked by encounters, violence, migration, mixture, and survival. The multiple dimensions of Latin identity reflect centuries of interaction among indigenous peoples of America, European colonizers, enslaved Africans, and later Asian immigrants. What we call Latino identity today is a result of these layered histories. It is racial, cultural, linguistic, and spiritual complexities shaped by the colonial structures and global movements. Some of you may not know this, but in Latin America's colonial period, about 15 times as many African slaves were taken to Spanish and Portuguese colonies than the U.S. That's 15 times. About 130 million people of African descent live in Latin America, and they make up roughly a quarter of the region's total population, according to recent estimates from the Project of Ethnicity and Race in Latin America at Princeton University. A Pew Research Center survey of Latino adults showed that 1/4 of all U.S. Latinos self-identify as Afro-Latinos, Afro-Caribbeans, or African descendant with roots in Latin America. When it comes to Asian Latinos are frequently unrecognized and acknowledgeable as a culture and social category in the United States, despite the growing number of Latinos, Latinas identifying with Asian heritage. Miguel de la Torre, in his first volume of Hispanic American Religious Culture, writes, in order to understand Asian, Latinos mestizaje, or miscegenation, we need to examine the historical context in which political and economic factors influence individuals to immigrate to the United States by either choice or force. A helpful essay, in my opinion, is Carlos Hiraldo's essay titled Arroz Frito, Fried Rice with Salsa, Asian Latinos and the Future of the United States. Hiraldo challenged the assumptions that Asian and Latinos occupy separate social worlds. He points out that a significant number of Latinos in the United States are of Asian ancestry, and that is a reality disrupting rigid racial categories. Asian Latinos expose the arbitrariness of racial labeling and challenge the dominant white minority paradigm. Their presence suggests the possibility of cross-ethnic solidarities that are not mediated by white hegemony, and they complicate stereotypes like the model minority and the narrative of Latino efficiency. Let me briefly add one more voice to this conversation. Don't know if my colleague is going to mention Reverend Robert Roberto Chao Romero, which is known to Fuller, and Kevin Escudero essay have examined how Asian Latinos complicated official racial categories, particularly in the U.S. Census. In their article, Asian Latinos in the U.S. Census, they show how census structures force individuals into racial boxes that fail to capture lived hybridity. Asian Latinos are often compelled to select classifications that do not fully reflect who they are. Finally, indigenous Latinos. Another important layer within Latinidad is indigenous identity. Indigenous Latinos are often rendered invisible. Their language, ancestral nations, and distinct histories are flattened under the broad level of Hispanics or Latinos. Yet many Latin American countries contain dozens of indigenous peoples whose presence predates European colonization. In the U.S., this complexity appears again in the census category because Hispanic is classified as an ethnicity and not a race. Some Latinos, especially in recent years, have identified as Native Americans. Historically, that is not inaccurate. Before European arrivals, their ancestors were indigenous to these lands. What complicates this is the long history of colonization, mixture, and erasure that has shaped how indigeneity is remembered or suppressed. One quote that I like from Dolores Cacuango, mother warrior from Ecuador, an indigenous advocate. She says, "We are like the grass of the highlands, always growing back even when torn apart." And that's the Latino indigenous identity. To summarize the complexity and beauty of the Latinx community, I know you're getting hungry. I invite you to consider the metaphor Cuban ethnographer Fernando Ortiz gave us, ajiaco. If you come from a Cuban background or other Latin Americans that have a similar dish, this traditional stew began with the Taíno people who contribute maize, malanga, potatoes, yuca, fish, and birds, seasoned with ají. The Spaniards, 500 years ago, added calabaza, nabo, beef. Africans, forcibly brought through slavery, enriched this with yams, plantains, and new cooking methods. Still later, Arabs and Chinese immigrants introduced spices that deepen its flavor. Each ingredient remained distinct, yet together they created something fuller, richer, and sustaining. Ortiz used ajiaco to describe Cuban culture, not as a melting pot where differences disappear, but as a dense broth in which every contribution matters. In the same way, the Latinx population in the United States is not a single story, but many. To understand this community is to recognize its layered histories, language, ancestries, and migrations. When we acknowledge each ingredient, we begin to see Latinidad not as a fixed category, but as a living, evolving reality shaped by encounter and survival.
As Saul and I were preparing, and all these wisdom that I learned from him about names and identification, it helped me to reflect on my own journey. For example, I'm not going to get into too much of the history. Some of you know the term Asian American was only coined a couple decades ago, but maybe, I don't remember a timeline, maybe 15, 20 years ago, it was the first time in the census where identifying as Taiwanese, there was this whole movement right in Taiwanese because there wasn't a category for, I don't know if there still is anymore, but all of it to say that sort of naming gives us our identity, and language is really significant. And so even the work that I've been doing in the world of Asian America, there are limitations to that. And what is wild is in our presentation planning process, I was recalling from my childhood so many Asian Latino experiences, things that felt like home to me that were not only Taiwanese. They were not exclusively Asian American. And so Even things like always looking for a really good Argentinian restaurant for my mom because she loves empanadas and alfajores. And having dulce de leche in our home, like all these little things, and then the hearing of Spanish and seeing an Asian phenotypical person, but their English sounds like Spanish English or Portuguese English, right? Like these are familiar things to me, but I share this picture here. Some of you, I don't know if you have young children. A couple years ago, we were struggling to find an Asian American doll for our kids. This is supposedly, I found this on Reddit, which I don't frequent, but it was a helpful search. Supposedly, this is every American girl, Asian American, and Pacific Islander. I don't know all these names, but I share this example because Saul was just talking about the American dream. What is the American dream? And I call this the Asian American dream because there's something that some of us know who identify with this community, which is many of us, whether it's ourselves, our parents, our elders, ancestors, left somewhere by force, by choice, necessity, in order to seek a future that would be better for posterity. And in that, we come to a land where you're plopped into empire and you have a pathway set up for you. And that pathway looks like conforming, assimilating, fitting into categories, working hard, all of these traits they're good things, but there's a lot happening inside, right? Which is potentially the dehumanization that is happening to ourselves, the increase of psychosomatic symptoms, mental health stress, all of these things. But I use this picture because this is another way of highlighting categories. It is really important to recognize the importance of representation. This does matter, that there are more diverse Asian American and Pacific Islander dolls available to young children, right? And at the same time, there is a limitation. And so the in-between of the pursuit of the American dream, but what does it look like in my body, in my identity? I'm not offering any answers. I'm saying this is part of that journey. And briefly, the three ways that I wanted to highlight Asian American relationship to U.S. empire, the first is erasure, right? So it's important to not just understand the stereotypes, but to understand what they're connected to. And so this is an article from Time Magazine from, I think, 2021, but it highlights, like, what is the history of exclusion, of erasure of Asian American invisibility? I'm not going to go through all of it, but I'll give an example. So many of you know from social media, news, it is the new Lunar New Year of the horse, the fire horse. I love that this is now knowledge shared beyond Asian American communities. It is celebrated at my kids' school. They had Lunar New Year performances this week. And it's a gift to have friends who don't typically celebrate it reach out and say, hey, Happy New Year, right? My family got together Monday night for a very intense, heavy, Shanghainese, delicious banquet dinner. And what I want to say, though, about this is that it is not simply celebrating the culture. It is not just knowing, oh, Taiwanese people eat this, right? Or these are the things that you celebrate. This is what you wear. That is wonderful. That is a beginning place. But what I want you to know is how I'm racialized. What is my relationship to U.S. empire? What are my feelings that come up in various spaces as a result of that relationship? And so this is what that knowledge is for, is to go beyond the cultural knowledge, but to, it's always important to understand relationship to higher structures. So erasure, right? Historically, there's a whole lot, not going over it, but as you know, you may not know actually, Asian Americans have been around for centuries, some as indentured servants as well, building railroad, all kinds of contributions. Another part of Asian American relationship to empire is extraction. And I don't mean like the Chris Hemsworth movie type of extraction. It's like extracting resources from this community. How do Asian Americans benefit empire? How do we survive within it? We have to work hard, do all these things. This applies to many communities, by the way, but this is an image of Indian immigrants who worked the lumber mills, who helped build Pacific Railroad lines. But it's the idea that while, yes, there was a component of survival, in that these communities become commodified, they're objectified, their very being is being extracted. And I think about the use of many Asians and Asian Americans in invisible places to do labor. And we don't even know how much, is happening behind the scenes. And lastly, exclusion. It's not wild to me now, but maybe some of you experienced this in grad school, that it wasn't until my doctorate that I learned about the Chinese Exclusion Act, right? I know these days it's more common knowledge, even in social media. It's helpful to have people share these things. But in general, the reason exclusion is part of Asian American racialization is that it's first phenotypical. There is a way that we unconsciously internalize what it means to look American, right? And no matter if my elders came to support the work of the railroad, doesn't matter if I'm fourth, fifth generation Asian American, I will still be asked questions of not belonging, right? About my language, about whatever, fill in the blank. But the forever foreigner, perpetual foreigner stereotype is really real. And so I share this just to remind our community that when we feel excluded, there are histories for that linger today. It fills the imagination or lack of imagination in our day-to-day living. And so we really need to understand the history. We need to understand the relationship to empire. We also want to understand our relationship to our Latino siblings, because a lot of this is happening. Wanting to highlight with a lot of the work of ICE these days, Latino and Asian communities are targeted the most. There's no question that Latino communities, first and foremost and most intensely and painfully, and speak for myself, for our Asian American communities, I hope that we remember and see and feel, because we share in much of this in-betweenness together. We're going to pivot a little bit as we enter this last section of our presentation to some of the clinical and medical healthcare system stuff, which is the work that we've been doing clinically, and talk about why does all this matter? How does Nepantla connect to the healthcare systems and the clinical work that we do? And on one hand, it is heartbreaking, just people have addressed the medical system as a medical industrial complex. And I'm working with physicians. Let me give you the context to why I was hired at Loma Linda. There were a few physician deaths, some were by suicide, right before I came. And if you know the data, physicians have a very high burnout rate and suicidal ideation rate, given not just the nature of the work, but I think once I was working in that context, the relationship to this complex, right? They are cogs in a wheel, oftentimes producing, filling quotas, counting the time, how many patients are seen, reaching the next goal, studying for the next exam. There's no breathing room. And so in that complex, which is, of course, fueled by capitalistic interests, this is a healthcare system that we are all connected to. You are either seeing your own provider in it or you are providing the care within that. So we really need to understand and ask these sort of questions. Similar to the story that Saul began with about this mother and son and how they were going about treating symptoms, understanding health, let's ask ourselves, how is health defined? Who is defining that? Where did that definition come from? What are the intentions of the people who are defining health, right? What does it look like to be healthy? Who is the giver of health and who is the healer? What is treatment? What is its purpose and intended outcome? I know these are very meta questions, but I think these are important because embedded in these questions, how we answer them helps us to know to what degree can we understand the in-between. Do we represent the medical industrial complex? We all do. It is part of how we live and breathe. If we use a DSM, if we diagnose, if we do billing, it's just, these are not inherently bad things. These are systems we have to live within. But we need to have a critical lens to understand what is it doing to our humanness, to our relationships between patient and therapist and client, patient and provider. The way that we internalize empire ourselves. We identify as healers, helpers, experts. We're also profit providers for this complex, right? And so what was really clear to me working within hospital systems with physicians is that it is nearly impossible to hold on to your own humanity. You have to adapt to that medical complex. There's no way to survive in empire. We are trying to fight to hold on to who we think we are, who we want to be, but there's just a natural flow of power that pulls us into the ideology of empire. And we really have to, I think the word resist, right? We have to actively resist because this is the default way that we will be pulled. And so asking, as we function within healthcare systems, who are we as whole integrated persons? How do we attune to the impact on our own well-being? Burnout, exhaustion, disconnect from self and others, right? This is a natural outcome of working within healthcare systems. And so much of the work I did for those years with the physicians is simply to remind them, I see you as a whole person. In these few years of residency, hang in there. Stay alive, literally. Eat and sleep. And don't let go of that part of you that you came to this for, right? So recognizing the healthcare system. In a moment, I'm paying attention to our time. Yeah, let's go to the clinical. Thank you. Good. We're going to go to clinical and end with some theological reflections. This is not overly granular, but thinking of Nepantla and the in-between as whole. We've talked about empire, what it does to us, our relationships, naming the names that empire gives to us, how we then identify, we lose parts of ourselves. So there's 3 clinical reflections I just wanted to leave you with. One is we must have socio-contextual awareness. This is no longer an option. In order to care for our clients, our patients, in this era of living within U.S. empire, we are not neutral providers. And to think that we are is really a mistake and honestly just not going to be helpful. All of the theories and interventions we use have values embedded within them. Just sort of like what Dr. Strawn was talking earlier about denominationally, theologically, there are implied belief systems within denominations. And the same goes for the theories that we use. And so in case you don't already know the term third order lens, those of you in MFT and those of you who've studied this, we have first order. I know my DMFT students know this, so very good. First order, second order, but third order lens is systems within systems. We cannot stop at the family or even community system. We have to understand, such as a lot of what we've talked about from morning till now, our positionality. We need to know our relationship to empire. We need to know how that affects our siblings. It is not just cultural competence. And this is what I was talking about earlier, right? When I was at the Shanghainese restaurant with my family on Sunday night, there was a moment where I was very emotional. I looked at this restaurant, it was packed. And I assumed that this was going to be a lot of, first generation elders, that there would be a lot of Chinese being spoken. But when I walked around the restaurant, it was all families like mine. We're all English speaking. These are second or third gen Asian Americans with our own children, and our parents are there, and we're celebrating this festival. And what hit me was why this is particularly meaningful. It's not just like a fun thing I get to eat and give money and get money, okay? It's not just that. It's that there is, in the midst of the hardness of life, the racialization that happens day in, day out, that this coming together as a community, seeing one another still lean into the joy, to delight in the exquisite cuisine, deliciousness of every food that has been passed on for generations, like that is what I'm celebrating. And to do it with my community in our minoritized state is empowering. And so there's both the yes, like celebrate it, but understand from a third order lens why this is impactful to your Latino American client, Asian American client, right? Yes, understanding cultural competence, these various traits is number one, but it goes much deeper. And in doing that, this is how we as clinicians are countering the invisibility and the erasure that our clients feel day to day. Second is our relationship with self. We've been hearing about this all day, and I hope this is really bringing the point home, which is we cannot do this work with our clients or patients unless we are processing and working through developing increased self-knowledge and awareness. Dr. Kenneth Hardy wrote in this amazing book of his, he's an MFT professor, The Enduring, Invisible, and Ubiquitous Centrality of Whiteness. And he wrote a similar chapter in another book. I think some of us have used it here. But he talks about the good, effective mainstream minority therapist, which is basically a minoritized therapist who fits really well into white systems. You don't rock the boat, your white counterparts like you're easy to work with because you don't make them feel bad, you're good at assimilating, you don't call them out, like this sort of thing, right? That was me when I first started out, and I lived with so much anxiety. Internally, I was so anxious as a beginning therapist, but I knew exactly how to fit in. So what I'm gonna just pivot to these questions and share, to what degree have we cut off parts of ourself in order to fit into our profession? The therapist, the psychologist, the chaplain, the pastor at the XYZ church, right? There is a subculture in whatever space, whatever field you are a part of. You may not be thinking about it, but you feel what you must be like, right? In order to belong. My encouragement to all of us is to ask these questions. How are we seeking to belong to that field? But how do we access all the parts of us to discover new ways to live into an identity that we can own? And I would add, who are the people, the professors, the colleagues, the supervisors, the friends that you can invite more and more parts of yourself into? Because that is how we then become the therapist, to use our Christian language, that God wants us to be. I'm still in that process, but I've been in the MFT field for 20 years, and it is an ongoing process. So the Nepantla idea for the self of the clinician, the therapist, is that many of us with various minoritized identities are navigating multiple worlds in the in-between, even as we develop into the clinician we seek to be. So I speak to our faculty, our supervisors. I hope you invite your students to have these conversations. They are part of the classroom. They are part of our mentoring. And lastly, I leave you with, I know we definitely don't have time to go into some deeper clinical work, but a really wonderful resource by Dr. Pilar Hernandez-Wolf. She is an associate professor of MFT at Lewis and Clark College. Just in 2024, she wrote this one article in our field on Nepantla. Nepantla Moments in Therapy, a clinical example with Latinx immigrants. So I hope that you will look for it. It's accessible in our library. That's where I found it. But what she talks about, maybe the one thing I'll highlight is this, that it is about the therapist and the client being able to mutually hold, it's a last point here, interpersonal tension. That movement toward the third space is possible. So in order to engage in this in-between work, there's no clear answer. The treatment plan is not going to be obvious what the end goal is going to be, right? But it's this idea that we have done our work, that sitting in the tension, the somatic things that come up, I know how to identify, and then I can offer that to the client and encourage them toward it. But it is that interpersonal space where regulation, recognition, responsibility, critical consciousness, there's this beautiful dance that's happening. And that is what allows for a third reality to surface. Lastly, I'm going to leave you with the resource. Socioculturally Attuned Family Therapy is an amazing resource. The 3rd edition is coming out any day now. I have a little brief contribution to it, but this is where third order lens is really unpacked. The very cool thing is not another model. It is applying third order lens to every family therapy model already. So if there's a model or an intersection of models that you like to use, this book helps us to know how might we have a socioculturally attuned lens integrated into that model already. So I will leave you with that. As we transition finally to theological reflections, I wanted to bring us back to colleague and dear friend of the Asian American Center, Reverend Dr. Robert Chow Romero. So he spoke at the Filipino American Ministry Initiative Symposium in the fall, and he was speaking about theology of the outsider. And there's so much that I received from his sharing. But the one thing that I highlight, I went back to my notes for this, migration is a source of God's unmerited favor and loving kindness to both immigrants and their host countries. This is what Dr. Chan spoke about, that it is not us as providers simply offering something to our clients. We're not the ones offering them a Nepantla space. We are being transformed as well in the process. A lot of the discourse these days, even if we are people who believe we love the foreigner. We want to care for them. We are migrants ourselves. But the discourse is so strong that we cannot help but internalize some of the very painful and harmful messages that are coming from our media, our politics, where we unconsciously put migrants in a category, right? We worry for them because they must be XYZ, right? But is there a way where we truly see the immigrant, the migrant, those who live in the in-between as our true sibling in Christ? That together, we don't need to offer them an in-between space. We are leaning into that in-between space because we are being transformed through their presence in our lives. So lastly, I'm gonna turn it over to Saul to wrap us up. We're gonna go just a few more minutes.
So Jessica asked me to conclude with a theological reflection, and I thought we could pass the offering plate and be done. Just perhaps these are some of my thoughts, and I had to write them down because I was, I think I put the mouse in, all right. Did I?
I think bring it back. Where did them? Oh, there it is. Okay.
So I had to write it down just to capture a little bit of what I think in the area of theology. So empire builds walls before they build bridges. And throughout history, empires have marked territories, drawn lines, enforced boundaries, determined who may enter, who must remain outside. Borders become instruments of control. Movement is restricted, identity is regulated, and belonging is policed. When we look at the US and Mexico border, we see more than geography. We see a visible reminder of power, sovereignty, exclusion, and fear. Steel, surveillance, checkpoints, these structures communicate rigidity. They tell us where we may and may not move. They define insiders and outsiders. And it's precisely in this space like this, where boundaries feel fixed and mobility feels constrained, that Nepantla becomes visible. And yet, even in places marked by rigidity, imagination sometimes emerges. Not to deny the existence of borders, not to dismantle them overnight, but to create a space for movements within their limits. That is where I want to introduce and perhaps conclude by sharing this different image. Here is the Cross-Border Express, or the CBX. Don't know how many of you have used it. It's a pedestrian bridge that connects the Tijuana International Airport directly to San Diego. It was constructed at a cost of roughly $170 million during a period when public rhetoric surrounding the US-Mexico border was dominated by restriction, surveillance, and division. The CBX does not erase the border. The line remains. There are checkpoints, procedures, regulations. The bridge does not pretend the boundaries do not exist. And yet, instead of reinforcing separation alone, someone envisioned infrastructure for connection. The CBX creates a structured passage suspended over the boundary itself. It allows travelers to move between two nations in a way that is regulated but fluid. It is neither fully Mexico nor fully United States. It sits in between. The bridge acknowledges limits, yet makes crossing possible. It does not dissolve tensions, it holds it. It does not collapse identity, it facilitates encounter. That is what makes such a compelling image of Nepantla. It is an intentional space designed to sustain difference while allowing movement. Thank you.
You all join me in thanking our presenters one more time. So we are in the home stretch of a very long day. Perhaps like me, you're feeling really tired, and not having a natural light makes you even more tired. I want to invite you to hang in there with us for a few more minutes while we do a final Q&A. We'll have an opportunity to have you all ask a few questions, maybe one actually, and I'll grab the iPad to make sure we can actually do that. As you prepare your questions and reflections, I first want to say thank you to both of you for your vulnerability. Thank you to Dr. Jessica ChenFeng for acknowledging how different this presentation feels than the many other presentations that you've given, and for choosing to say yes and to invite Dr. Barcelo to come and be with us. Thank you for choosing, Dr. Barcelo, to honor your friendship with Dr. Jessica ChenFeng by coming, even though you thought about saying no and canceling. Well, I can understand that. I thought about canceling too, actually, even as co-chair, but it wasn't my best choice. It's a gift to be here in vulnerability, to talk about what it means to be in between. And I just wanted to reflect on a few things that stood out to me. I took quite a few notes, but there are 5 things that just stood out to me in terms of things that you all said that felt new or fresh or hit me in a really significant way. And the first was thinking about the relationship between language and naming and power that you all highlighted. And that's been a through line, I think, throughout today for those who have been present earlier in the morning and this afternoon. Thinking about the ways that words and who uses those words and what power they have kind of shape how we understand ourselves and how other people understand us. I also heard you, Dr. Barcelo, talk about double or triple vision as something that might be an honored form of insight and not only something that might be concerning or understood in a different way. I heard you all talking about naming layered histories and lived hybridity and how powerful it is to acknowledge those layers rather than this urge that I think we have psychologically to simplify and to reduce. It is easier cognitively and emotionally to categorize, to define in reductionistic ways that are not holistic, that are not healthy. And it's helpful for us to remember that. I also appreciate the metaphor of ahiako. I'm not sure if I got that right. The stew where every contribution is really seen and it's not erased in some way, but it actually all brings everything even more so to life. And then I appreciated the brief comment that you made about Nepantla as a spiritual and religious invitation as well. Thinking about faith and doubt, thinking about the ways that hybridity is a part of what it means for us as humans and for us to pay attention to what that might look like for us, I think theologically as well. So with those reflections of mine in mind, I wanted to ask this first question as I think about other questions that might come in. And this first one is asking you all to elaborate on perhaps your last set of comments theologically. Thinking about why you believe the construct of Nepantla is essential, perhaps not optional, for people of faith, for people who follow Jesus. Why does it matter? And I'll give one more comment saying I can imagine many folks, whether they're here or outside of here, might say this feels like a super secular conversation. Feels like what we're talking about is for socio-political context out there. Why do you all say as people who follow Jesus, this is something that matters?
I'm actually going to turn it to Dr. Barcelo. Because of time, we actually didn't get to this amazing theological reflection that he had, which I will invite him to. Please speak to.
Thank you. And this, again, I was tempted to just do offering, but I end up writing a theology of Nepantla, which I wasn't sure because of your discipline. I mean, this is something that is natural for me. Everything I think of, a theology must inspire my approach to caring for others, to just living life, pretty much. And so one of the things I was going to mention is that incarnation of Jesus is the ultimate sign of Nepantla that invites us to consider what it means to always be in between, in heaven, earth, the spirit, the physical. And so there's a lot of, well, I refer to the Nahuatl and tradition and culture. In Christianity, there's a lot of richness as you look at Jesus, his life, his ministry. Gloria Saldúa talks about how as we embrace Nepantla, we should also become Nepantleros, which means you are bridge builders, which you do very well in your clinicals with patients. And as you look at the life of Jesus, he did that not only spiritually, but he lived that model as he crossed cultural boundaries, religious boundaries, you name it. All these boundaries that were there, he was a Nepantlero. And so I would even argue that at the end, the cost of Nepantlero is heavy. As a therapist, as an individual, as a person of faith. For Jesus, the cross is the ultimate price for living Nepantla, for connecting two worlds. And as we carry this symbol, you see it in your institutions, in your places of worship. That cross, I mean, if you think of the Romans, Romans wouldn't even give that as a sentence to them. It was only for outsiders, people who didn't belong, who didn't have a category, criminals, you name it, outcasts, immigrants, but not Romans. And so when we see the cross now is so popular, we have beautiful jewelry, tattoos, shirts, but in reality, it reminds us of Nepantla, the price of Nepantla, of connecting two worlds, of helping us bridge these gaps that were there because of sin, and you name it. So I did develop a little bit of theology on Nepantla, and I thought for people of faith, the life of Christ symbolizes Nepantla.
So beautiful on so many levels. And I think, as I think about the privilege of being in an academic institution where we get to have these types of conversations, I'm reminded that it's really easy to take so many things for granted, even Jesus serving as a Nepantlero. Say it again.
Nepantlero.
We'll work on that. But I think about in him embodying this really important characteristic and trait. He's, bearing the cost in this particular way. He's knowledgeable about it. That's something I never hear preached about in sermons, is Jesus' knowledge that he's crossing barriers of gender and of ethnicity and of nationality and of so many other things. And so what does it mean for us as those in academic spaces who get to learn to be intentional? We pay money to be intentional, to think about things that in the rest of our lives, in normal practices, might be difficult to do. I think about reflecting on Jesus and his intentionality and crossing those borders makes me wonder what it means for us to be intentional about that as well. I wondered also if you all would share something about your own process. You referenced it briefly, of working together as those who don't exist in a black or white binary to put this presentation together, what you discovered or became highlighted for you and your relationship with each other or in your own self. That might have been something that you're comfortable sharing with the rest of us.
I think this is probably, I'm processing this live, maybe. There's a lot that's been happening during my sabbatical on a personal level. One thing is I've been leaning into creativity. So not having clear definitions of my time, things like that. And I was just telling Saul earlier today that working on this presentation has felt like neither of us knew how it was going to turn out. We didn't have a clear vision for it. But as we kept having conversation, it's like what we needed to present then showed up. And then I was encountering new parts of myself to put into it. And that was very different than how I typically put something together. And so I feel like it's been a very somatic experience for me. And last night, one of my good friends from my home church, I won't share her name because then it's a very unique Spanish-sounding name. I texted her and asked, how do you identify? Like, do you identify as Asian? Because she was born in Argentina, but is ethnically Taiwanese. And do you identify as Asian, Latino? And so, like, it's really strange. What I love discovering and learning new things about my self-identity because of relationship. So it's still disorienting, though, to realize one of my closest friends is Taiwanese Argentinian. And anytime I say, oh, my friend such and such, people will be like, oh, are they Hispanic? Are they Latina? I'm like, oh, no, she's Taiwanese. So I guess I'm just sharing, like, this is the power of language, which is feeling like my whole life, I only had Asian American and Taiwanese American to identify myself and my family, when it's much more expansive. And my cultural experiences really crossed Asian, Latino intersections. My faith, the food that feels like home to me. And so, and then I will just make a comment about working together. There is it's not, how do I explain this? I know Saul will see this as a positive, but it will sound strange. Working with Saul felt like working with an Asian American woman.
High praise.
Okay,
High praise.
right? That is the highest praise. What I mean by that is it was so collaborative. It was always checking in, like, what do you think about that? What's your expertise? Like, and you could share more about this if you want, but just I was curious. I'm like, what is that about? Like, what allows you to do that, you know? And so I think there's a lot of intersections of his identity, his own work, but very atypical of my like co-collaboration experience. Yeah.
Wow, thank you. I'm gonna be honest. I told her this. I'm like, the only reason I have to, I'm showing up. One is because of you. Second, I want to make sure I don't let you down because I get to leave to Loma Linda, and nobody wants to commute, especially on Friday, for 3 hours to chase me. You get to stay here. You know, your students, your colleagues, they get to see you. So. But I think at the end of the day, I did tell her, my commitment is to you to make sure that we find something where we can share, we can work, and it's rough at the beginning, finding ways, spaces, we juggle family, commitments. So all that, and perhaps, what we have to remember is just making a commitment to the other. Those who we encounter, from the patient, the clinic, making not just a transaction, not what the medical or healthcare system has done, but it's a relation that we build. And so when you make that commitment, you're gonna work or find a way to work together, even if it's rough, even if there's tension, even if you figure it out. Like, I'm not sure this is the direction we want to go. So, anyways.
Can I also add something? I think one of the things I wanted to say, but we didn't get to mention, is the friendship outside of work. And I would say this goes for a lot of my friendships with people of different intersectional identities from myself, which is, in the beginning, when you are cultivating that relationship, it takes a lot of courage from both parties to lean in and to care about the other person's experience, identity. Through the pandemic, when there was a lot of anti-Asian hate, Saul would text, hey, how are you? How's your community? Right? And vice versa. Like, after I watched the Super Bowl halftime show, I texted Saul. I was like, how was it for you and your family? Like, how did that land on you? I know how I felt, but I want to know how it felt for you. This is your community. Even, I know this sounds trite, but like sharing a food. Saul receives the Taiwanese pineapple cakes that I offer and enjoys them, right? So these seem like small things, but this is part of cultivating shared experiences, especially as relate to U.S. empire, but also truly seeing the quote-unquote other, and that this is not his community. We belong to one another. And there's a lot that we're going through that we share. And so, and it's worth taking the time to care and understand.
I appreciate you highlighting how your personal history has allowed your professional work to be as rich and deep as it is. The fluidity in which you all share and the depth of vulnerability is correlated with the actual personal investment that you all have made. And I think about that in my work with Brad. I think about that in work with other colleagues, where what we've poured into our working relationship is built on something authentic and real personally. And then that allows what comes from that, whether that's in writing, right, or in speaking or in some other context, hopefully to be really meaningful. I want to ask this final question here. One person from our audience has asked, might we think about the kingdom of God on earth as a kind of Nepantla? There's something about God's kingdom and this in-betweenness that you might elaborate on or make any additional comment about that possibility for a framework?
We did have sort of talk about this in a conversation over the phone this week about we live in a ready but not yet reality, and that especially when Saul was talking in the slide about the contemporary understandings of Nepantla, that any of us in the in-between space, I think our identity as followers of Jesus fills that space, right? We are living in the world, but not of it. We are trying to navigate living out kingdom values while struggling with the pains of our physical bodies. Like something, for example, what was very disorienting for me this week is my mom was victim to a phishing scam. And then like it was such a headache and worry that someone took over her phone and she had to like do all this stuff with credit. And just like the vulnerable, like this is the world. Like we are trying to live out a life of goodness and doing what's right. And at the same time, it's lived alongside harm and pain. So it is a very weird in-between space. So those are some of my initial thoughts.
She said it all. But I do love the question, and I think definitely it's thinking about our reality today as people of faith, highlighting the tension between empire and the kingdom. Never the same, and I think the kingdom has a higher call, and it should be manifest in how we care for our client, our neighbor, even the people that we don't always agree with. And so I think that is a way to go, to be thinking about that tension that we experience.
I appreciate you naming that there is a tension between the empire that we live in and God's kingdom. God's kingdom is, as some will describe, an upside-down kingdom where the principles and values of this earth, the principles and values of the countries that we live in, do not overlap. There's not a one-to-one correlation. We live in a season right now in human history and American history where conflation has become really popular. Whatever the values are of the system that we live in, that could be the God's kingdom values, and we always have to pause and ask, are those the values of the kingdom? And we get to ask that question, I think, with some humility and also hopefully with courage. I want to make this final comment before I invite Dr. Strawn to wrap us up. Today has been really full and really rich. I was talking with a few of you all in the hall earlier and acknowledging that I was like, how are you doing? And she was like, I don't know how I'm doing. I don't know how I'm feeling. And I so appreciate the honest response of, I'm not sure yet. And I responded by saying, I feel that every year at the symposium. We're in the middle, I'm not 100% sure how I'm doing. And I want to encourage you all as we come to the end of today and you consider coming back tomorrow to give yourself an intentional, purposeful pause to check in and digest where you are. It is really difficult in real time during the whole day to actually pay attention to what is stirring up inside of you and to what the Holy Spirit is fully saying and doing. So I want to encourage you before you leave and you kind of just hit the road and do the rest of your day and tomorrow to say, I'm going to give myself just 10 minutes to sit with what came up, whether I took notes or not, whether I want to reflect on anything in particular, just to see where am I. I also want to invite you to purposely choose to reflect with someone else about what's come up. Mutuality has been a theme of today's presentations, to ask us to be in dialogue, not only intrapsychically in our own heads, but also interpersonally and collectively. So over this final 24 hours we head into tomorrow, I encourage you both to talk to folks if you came with someone, but perhaps to talk with someone new, even over coffee tomorrow morning or as you leave. How are you doing? Do you know how you're doing? Here's what I'm taking away. To have a moment for genuine encounter that might be meaningful and a surprise, as some of our folks earlier have talked about. So with that final comment, I'll turn it over to Dr. Strawn to wrap us up.
Thank our speakers again from this keynote. Fantastic. Thank you again for joining us today, and we do want to heartily invite you back tomorrow at 9 a.m. Dr. Fort and I will be taking these conversations to another space, we hope, by talking about leaning into our vulnerabilities and leaning into our authenticities in clinical and ministerial contexts. So what does this look like? That's what we're going to try to talk about with you tomorrow morning.